Chapter 1. The Shadow Before the Birth. Tonight we go far back, further back than most stories dare to reach. We go to the first age of Middle-earth, a time so ancient that the world itself was shaped differently than you know it, when the great land of Beleriand still existed in the northwest of the world and had not yet been swallowed by the sea, when the elves were young and the men newer still, and when Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, the one of whom Sauron was merely a shadow and a servant, sat in his fortress of Angband in the north and looked out at the free peoples of the world with the patient, total hatred of something that has decided to unmake everything it sees. We begin not with our hero, but with his father, because the story of Turin Turambar cannot be understood without the story of Húrin of Dorlomin, cannot be felt without first feeling the weight of what was done to a father, and what that doing cost a son who was not yet born when the doing was completed. Húrin was, by the reckoning of the First Age, one of the greatest men who ever lived. Not greatest in the way of kings who accumulate power, though he was a lord and a warrior of extraordinary ability, but greatest in the deeper sense of being most fully, most completely, most uncompromisingly himself. He was fierce and proud, and possessed of a particular kind of courage that does not diminish in the face of hopelessness, but becomes, if anything, more concentrated, more purely itself. He fought at the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, near Naes Arnoediad, in the tongue of the elves, which was the great catastrophe of the First Age, the battle in which the free peoples of Beleriand made their last, largest, most coordinated attempt to overthrow Morgoth's power, and were destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. Betrayed from within, overwhelmed from without, broken in a single day of fighting so catastrophic that the field itself was renamed for what lay upon it afterward. A hill of the slain, where the bodies of men and elves were piled so high that Morgoth's servants built upon them, and the hill remained for an age as a monument to what absolute power does when it decides to demonstrate itself. Húrin was taken alive. This was not mercy. Morgoth did not practice mercy, had no use for it, understood it only as a tactical concept, and despised it even. Then, Húrin was taken alive because Morgoth wanted something from him. Information about the hidden city of Gondolin, the great elven stronghold whose location was the most jealously kept secret in all of Beleriand. Húrin knew the way. He had been brought there by the eagles, had walked its streets, had known its king, and Morgoth wanted it. Húrin did not tell him. He did not tell him across hours of questioning, across days, across whatever Angband's particular methods of persuasion were. And those methods were, by the testimony of those who survived them, thorough. He did not break. He did not bend. He laughed at Morgoth. This is one of the most extraordinary moments in all of Tolkien's legendarium. A mortal man, chained in the fortress of the first and greatest Dark Lord, being offered his freedom in exchange for the secret that would destroy everything he loved, and laughing. Not bravely, not performatively, genuinely. With the specific laughter of someone who understands exactly what they are facing, and has decided that this particular thing is not worth bending for. Morgoth cursed him for it. Not in the casual way of an angry person reaching for the cruelest word available, in the deliberate, intentional, cosmically committed way of a Vala who has spent the entirety of his vast existence developing the capacity to do harm at the deepest possible level. He cursed Húrin's bloodline. He placed upon the house of Húrin a shadow, not a death, not a simple punishment, but something longer and more patient and more terrible than either, a doom, a working of his will that would follow everything Húrin loved, across the years and the miles and the choices and the distances between people, finding each of them in turn, shaping the world around them toward ruin. And then he placed Húrin on a high seat of stone on the slopes of Thangorodrim, the great volcanic mountain above Angband, and gave him, by his power, the ability to see, to watch, to observe, across all of Beleriand, everything that happened to his wife and his children and his people, from the moment of the curse until the moment of his death. Unable to intervene, unable to warn, unable to do anything except see. This was the punishment. Not chains, not darkness, sight. The specific, sustained, unending cruelty of perfect knowledge without the ability to do anything with it. Into this shadow, shortly after the battle, a boy was born. Morwen, Húrin's wife, herself one of the great and proud women of the First Age, called Elethwen, Elfsheen, for the quality of light that seemed to live in her, bore a son in the grief of her husband's capture and the ruin of her people. She named him Túrin. He was dark-haired and grey-eyed, and from his earliest years possessed of a quality of interior intensity that made people around him feel, without being able to say precisely why, that they were in the presence of something that was going to matter. Something that was going to do things, great things, terrible things, and that the world was going to be different for his having been it. He was 8 years old when his mother sent him away to Doriath, the hidden kingdom of the great elven king Thingol, protected by the enchantments of Melian the Maya. Because Dorlomin was no longer safe, because the shadow of Morgoth lay heavy on the lands of men, because Morwen loved her son with the fierce, proud, almost unbearable love of a woman who has already lost everything else and cannot lose this too. She sent him away to save him, and he went, not understanding fully what the going meant, that he would not see his mother again for years, would not see his home again, would carry the specific, unresolvable grief of the child who was sent away for their own good, and who does not, for a very long time, entirely forgive it. Rest now, dear one. The shadow has been laid. The boy has left his home. And somewhere on the high seat of Thangorodrim, a father is watching and cannot look away. Chapter 2. The Years in Doriath. Breathe now. In slowly and out. Let the first chapter settle into its place. The curse, the father on his high seat, the boy sent away into the forest. You are still here, still held. And we continue now into the years of Túrin's growing, years that were, on their surface, years of relative safety and relative grace, and that were, beneath that surface, the years in which everything that would eventually destroy him was quietly, steadily becoming more completely itself. Doriath was, in the first age of Middle-earth, the closest thing to an enchanted kingdom that the world possessed. Not enchanted in the diminished decorative sense that the word has acquired in lesser stories, truly, functionally, literally enchanted. Protected by the girdle of Melian, a ward of such power that nothing entered Doriath without Melian's knowledge and consent, a ward woven from the will of a Maya who had walked in Valinor and knew the deep music of the world. Within it, the forest of Neldoreth and region grew ancient and untouched. The river Esgalduin ran silver between the roots of enormous trees, and in the cave palace of Menegroth, Thingol the Grey Cloak sat on his throne, the greatest of the elven kings of Middle-earth, ancient beyond any reckoning that men could easily comprehend, with the particular quality of presence that belongs to something very old that has not yet begun to contemplate its own ending. Túrin grew up here, among elves, which is to say, among beings who moved through the world differently than men, who related to time differently, who carried their griefs and their joys in different registers, who looked at a young, dark-haired mortal boy with the mixture of genuine fondness and gentle, aching awareness of his brevity that the elves always brought to their love of men. He was fostered by Thingol himself, which was an honor so extraordinary that it has no real equivalent. A mortal child, raised in the house of an elven king, treated as a son of that house, given the education and the training and the proximity to greatness that shaped him into the warrior and the thinker and the proud, unbending, sometimes impossible person he became. He was not easy. Let us be honest about this from the beginning, because the story deserves honesty. Túrin was never easy. He was brilliant. His mind was quick and his instincts were sound, and his capacity for learning in the arts of war and of language and of the lore that Doriath's elves preserved was genuinely extraordinary. He was also proud in the specific, deep-rooted way of someone who has been taught by the circumstances of their birth and their exile and the quality of their own gifts that pride is not a flaw, but a necessity. That in a world as hostile as the one he had been born into, the alternative to pride was something he could not afford. There was an incident. An elf of Doriath named Seiros, who had never loved the mortal boy fostered in his king's house with more honor than many elves received, made a remark, a cruel remark, about the women of men, about Morwen, in the specific way of someone who knows exactly which wound to press, and presses it with deliberate, smiling precision. Túrin's response was immediate and disproportionate and entirely, completely characteristic. He humiliated Seiros, physically, publicly, in a manner that left no doubt about what he was capable of and no room for the other man's dignity to survive the encounter intact. Seiros, the following morning, ambushed him on the road. This was perhaps not his most considered decision. Túrin disarmed him and drove him in the specific, relentless way that Túrin did everything, until Seiros, fleeing in terror across the forest, fell into a rocky gorge and died. An accident, or nearly an accident, the kind of thing that is an accident in the letter and not entirely an accident in the spirit. because Túrin had known the terrain and had not, in those final moments, done anything to prevent what he must have seen coming. He did not wait to be judged. This is the first great expression of the pattern that would define his life. The pattern of the man who acts, who suffers the consequences of his action, and who then, rather than remaining to be held accountable, departs. Not in cowardice. Túrin was not a coward, not in the conventional sense, in pride. In the specific, anguished pride of someone who cannot bear to be judged by others for something he has already judged himself for, more harshly than any court would manage. He left Doriath before the verdict, before Thingol, who would have pardoned him, who did pardon him in his absence, could offer him the mercy he could not accept. He went into the wild, into the years of outlawry, living on the fringes of Beleriand with a band of rough men, none of whom were notably improved by his company, and some of whom were considerably worse than he was. He led them. He was, even in outlawry, a natural leader. The kind of person that other people organize themselves around, not because he asks them to, but because the force of what he is creates its own gravity. He protected people where he could. He was dangerous in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes not. He was, in those years, becoming more completely himself, and whether that was a good thing depended entirely on where you were standing. And then Beleg found him. Now we arrive at the thing that makes this chapter worth everything that precedes it. Now we arrive at the friendship that is, in all of Tolkien's legendarium, one of the most complete and most heartbreaking portraits of what it means to love someone whose nature makes them very difficult to love consistently, and to love them anyway, completely, without condition, without requiring them to be other than what they are. Beleg Cuthalion, Beleg Strongbow, the greatest archer in all of Doriath, in all of Beleriand by many reckonings, and Túrin's closest friend. He had known Túrin in Doriath. He had found him in the wild, and he had come, with Thingol's pardon and his own great bow Belthronding, and the specific, unwavering quality of someone who has decided that this particular person is worth finding in whatever dark place they have retreated to. He had come back. We will speak more of Beleg in the next chapter. He deserves more than a closing paragraph. He deserves everything the story can give him, which is, in the end, not enough. Rest now. Túrin is in the wild, and Beleg is coming. Hold that. Hold the arrival of the one who will come back for him as you drift towards sleep. Chapter 3, Beleg Strongbow. Breathe, dear one, in and out. Let the quiet of the forest settle over you, the ancient, enormous quiet of Beleriand's wild places, where the trees are old enough to have their own memories, and the darkness between them is soft rather than frightening. You are safe here, and I want to spend this whole chapter with Beleg because he deserves it, because the story rushes past him sometimes in the hurry to get to the tragedy, and I have always found that the rushing past is itself a kind of injustice to one of Tolkien's most quietly extraordinary creations. Beleg Cuthalion was an elf of Doriath, specifically a march warden, one of those charged with guarding the borders of Thingol's kingdom, with moving through the wild places of Beleriand, and ensuring that what came toward Doriath was known and assessed and managed before it arrived. He had been doing this for longer than most men's civilizations had existed. He knew every path in the forests of Neldoreth and region. He knew the rivers and the high ground and the places where Morgoth's creatures moved, and the places where they didn't, and why. He was, by any measure available to the First Age, extraordinarily good at his work. He was also, and this is the thing about him that matters most for our story, the kind of person who chose his loyalties with great care and then held them beyond the point where any reasonable accounting would have released him. He loved Túrin, not romantically. Let us be clear about what kind of love this was, because the clarity matters. The love of a friend who has seen clearly what the other person is, the greatness and the catastrophe of them in equal measure, and has decided that the seeing does not change the staying. That kind of love. The rarest kind. The kind that does not require the beloved to be other than what they are in order to be worth loving. He found Túrin in the wild, tracked him through Beleriand with the skill of someone who has been reading forest sign for thousands of years, and came to him not as a messenger of judgment, but as himself, as Beleg. Carrying Thingol's pardon, yes, but more importantly, carrying his own continued presence, his own choice to be here, his own willingness to follow this particular person into whatever difficulty the following entailed. And it entailed a great deal. Túrin's band of outlaws were rough men who did not immediately trust an elf from Doriath arriving in their camp, and their distrust expressed itself in the specific physical way of rough men who have decided that distrust should be immediately actionable. Beleg endured this with remarkable patience. He stayed. He proved himself, not by performing for the outlaws, not by demonstrating his power in ways designed to impress them, but simply by being, over time, consistently useful, and consistently present, and consistently someone whose word meant what it said. Túrin trusted him, and because Túrin trusted him, the others came around. This is the specific dynamic of a natural leader's inner circle. The people around Túrin organized their own trust through his, which was efficient, if somewhat hierarchically convenient for Beleg. They fought together. This is worth saying with the weight it deserves. They fought together as a pair in the wild places of Beleriand, holding a stretch of territory against Morgoth's encroachments with a combination of Beleg's skill and knowledge and Túrin's ferocity and tactical brilliance that was, by the accounts preserved in the records, genuinely formidable. There were years of this, years of the two of them moving through the forest together, watching each other's backs, knowing each other's instincts well enough to fight as a single thing rather than two separate ones. The shorthand that develops between people who have faced genuine danger together, the communication that becomes possible when you have trusted someone with your life enough times, that trust is no longer a decision, but simply a fact of how you move. Beleg tried to guide him. This is the quietly painful part of their story. Not the end, not yet, but the ongoing, gentle, never quite successful effort of a wiser friend to steer a proud one away from the choices that were going to cost them both. He counseled patience. He counseled return to Doriath. where Thingol's protection could shield them from Morgoth's increasing attention. He pointed out, with the careful, consistent care of someone who knows that the person they are talking to does not respond well to being told what to do, that the path Túrin was choosing was narrowing, that the options available to a man at the center of Morgoth's attention were fewer and fewer, and that the time to change direction was before the path ran out rather than after. Túrin listened. He valued Beleg's counsel more than anyone else's, more than he valued most things that came from outside himself. And then, with the specific, devastating consistency of his character, he did what he had already decided to do anyway. Not always, not every time, but enough times, and on enough of the consequential occasions, that the pattern was legible to anyone watching from the outside. And from the high seat of Thangorodrim, Húrin was watching. And from the deep darkness of Angband, something else was watching too. There came a night, and we must speak of it, because the story requires it, though it is the hardest part of Beleg's story, and one of the hardest in all of Tolkien, when Túrin was captured. His band had been betrayed by one of their own. Mime the petty dwarf, who had his own reasons and his own griefs, and who is not a simple villain even in this, because the First Age does not traffic in simple villains any more than life does. Captured, bound, dragged north in the company of Morgoth's orcs, through the forest, through the long nightmare miles of someone being taken toward the one place in all of Beleriand that no one who entered left unchanged. Beleg followed. Of course he followed. This is not even a question in the story. There is no deliberation recorded, no counsel of whether to go, no weighing of the risks against the chances. Beleg followed because Túrin was taken, and Beleg was Beleg, and the following was simply what that meant. He tracked the orc band through Beleriand. He found allies where he could, including a young elf named Gwyndor, escaped from the mines of Angband himself, and therefore possessing the specific, terrible expertise of someone who had been where Túrin was being taken and had survived it. Together they tracked. Together they found. They found Túrin in a camp in the forest of Taur Nufuin, the forest under nightshade, which had once been the fair woodland of Dorthonion before Morgoth's power turned it into something else entirely. He was bound to a tree, unconscious, alive. And Beleg, who had tracked him across half of Beleriand, and had not slept, and had not stopped, and had not permitted himself to consider what he would find, looked at his friend bound to a tree in the darkest forest in the world, and began, very carefully, to cut him free. Rest now. Beleg has found him. The cutting free is about to begin. And I want you to be rested for what comes next, because what comes next is the hardest thing. Chapter 4, The Darkness in Taur Nufuin. Be still. Let your body be completely heavy and completely warm, in and out. The forest is dark around us tonight. The specific heavy dark of Túrin, where even the stars are dimmed by the shadow of what Morgoth's power has done to the trees and the soil and the quality of the air itself. But you are safe here. You are outside the story, looking in. I am with you, and I will not leave you before the chapter ends. Beleg cut Túrin free in the darkness of the orc camp, working with the slow, careful precision of someone who cannot afford to make noise and who is operating in near total darkness, and who has, in addition to all of this, the specific, trembling urgency of someone whose friend is right here, right in front of them, alive, but barely. And the cutting free is the only thing between that aliveness and whatever comes next, if they are discovered. He used his knife. Anglachel, the great sword he carried, given to him by Thingol, was too large for this work. The knife was better. He worked in silence, in the dark, with Gwyndor watching the perimeter and the camp of orcs sleeping around them, with the particular quality of sleep that belongs to things that are not entirely concerned about what might come for them in the night, because they are themselves the kind of thing that comes for others. The knife slipped in the darkness against the bonds. A small thing, the blade turning against a tough cord, the hand adjusting, the point moving in a direction it had not been directed. It cut Túrin's foot. A small wound, painful but not serious, enough to wake him suddenly, completely, in the specific, disoriented way of someone waking from a half-conscious stupor in the middle of a dark forest, surrounded by enemies who have been hurting them for days. Not knowing, in that first fractured second of consciousness, where he was. Not knowing who was beside him, knowing only that something in the dark had cut him again. He seized Beleg. With the strength of a man who has been trained his whole life and who is operating on the deep animal instinct of someone who has learned across the days of his captivity that things that come to you in the dark in this place come to hurt you. He grappled with the person beside him in the darkness. And Beleg, who had followed him across half of Beleriand, who had not slept, who was exhausted and holding a knife in the dark with an orc camp 10 feet away. Beleg, who knew it was Túrin, who was trying to say his name, who was trying to make him understand, could not, in the confusion of those seconds, get free of his friend's grip before the knife found him. He died in Túrin's arms. In the darkness of Túrin, with the orc camp sleeping around them and Gwyndor watching from the shadows and the stars hidden above the corrupted canopy of the forest, Beleg Cuthalion, the greatest archer in Beleriand, the best friend Túrin ever had, the one who had come back, the one who had always come back, died. Not in battle, not by Morgoth's direct hand, not in any way that the legend would have chosen if the legend had been choosing. By accident, by the specific, irreversible accident of a dark night and a knife, and a man waking from nightmare into what he could not have known was not nightmare, but rescue. Túrin understood in the next moment what he had done. The full understanding came all at once. Gwyndor telling him, the body in his arms, the face of his friend, visible now in a gleam of lightning through the trees, the specific quality of a face that has just stopped being a person and become a thing the person inhabited. he understood. And the understanding was, there is no word for what it was. There is no word in any language I know that adequately contains the specific quality of that particular grief. The grief of having killed by accident the one person who loved you without condition, who had crossed half a world to find you, who had a knife in his hand and your name in his mouth when the accident happened. He did not weep immediately. This is worth noting. The first response was not tears, but a stillness so complete it frightened Gwyndor, who had seen terrible things and had his own measure of what terrible looked like. A stillness like the stillness of the orc camp around them, the stillness of something that has temporarily stopped registering the world. Then he lifted Beleg, carried him out of the camp, found a place in the forest a little away where the ground was softer and the trees less corrupted by Morgoth's influence. And he sat with him through the rest of that night, while Gwyndor waited and the camp woke and moved on, and the danger passed without finding them, because perhaps even Morgoth's servants had the obscure decency to leave this particular grief alone. In the morning he took Anglachel, Beleg's sword, the great blade that Thingol had given to Beleg, and Beleg had carried through all the wild years of their friendship. A black blade, made from iron that had fallen from the sky, a meteorite in the language of later ages, with an edge that could cut almost anything, and a history that was, even then, longer and darker than either of them had fully known. He took it because it was there, and because he was a man who needed a sword, and because taking it was a way of carrying Beleg forward, of having something of him present in the years that were coming, which were going to require everything Túrin had, and then some. Gwyndor led him eventually away to Nargothrond, the great hidden kingdom of Finrod's line, now ruled by Orodreth. A new chapter, a new identity, a new name. This is the pattern of Túrin's life. The flight from one place, the arrival at another, the construction of a new self in a new context, and the eventual discovery that the shadow had arrived before him, had been waiting, had known with the patient certainty of something that does not rush, that he would come. But before we go to Nargothrond, before we follow him into the next chapter of the doom, let us stay here for one more moment, in the forest, with the memory of Beleg, with the specific, irreducible fact of what was lost in Taur Nu Fuin, not only a friend, but the one relationship in Túrin's life that had been to that point entirely without cost, entirely given, entirely free. Gone now, by an accident in the dark, by a knife and a wound and a man waking where he should not have been sleeping. Rest now. The forest is behind us. Beleg is behind us. And Túrin carries his sword forward into whatever comes next. Chapter 5. Nargothrond and the Black Sword. Breathe now. In, slowly, and out. Let the darkness of Taur Nu Fuin settle behind you, not forgotten but placed, given its proper weight in the story's architecture, and then allowed to rest there while we continue. We have further to travel, and the story does not slow down simply because we wish it to. It moves at the pace of a doom, which is to say, steadily, without hurry, without mercy, and with complete indifference to whether we are ready. Nargothrond was the greatest of the elven kingdoms of the First Age after the fall of Gondolin. A vast underground city carved into the banks of the river Narog, with halls and galleries and forges and libraries that rivaled anything above ground in the world. It had been built by Finrod Felagund, the most beloved of the Noldorin kings, who had died years before in fulfillment of an oath to a mortal man named Barahir, Túrin's great-grandfather, as it happened, which is the kind of connection that Tolkien's legendarium makes routinely and that never quite stops being quietly astonishing. Now it was ruled by Orodreth, cautious and careful, and possessed of the specific quality of leadership that knows its own limitations and tries to govern within them, which is an admirable quality and one that was, in the company of Turin Turambar, going to be severely tested. Túrin arrived with Gwyndor and was received with the honor due a great warrior, which he was, and the caution due a stranger, which he also was. He did not use his own name. This is significant and worth dwelling on. The pattern of new names is not merely a disguise, but something more psychologically complex. Each name Túrin took in his life was a version of himself he was constructing to replace the version that the last catastrophe had made untenable. Adonedel, the elf man, they called him in Nargothrond, for his bearing and his elvish education. Later, Mormogil, the black sword, for the blade he carried and the way he used it. Names that were true in their way, that described real things about him, and that were also, in the deepest sense, not his name. Not the name his mother had given him, not the name under which the curse ran. He rose quickly in Nargothrond. Of course he did. Rising quickly was what Túrin did in every new context, because the combination of his gifts was simply irresistible to any military organization that encountered it. Tactical brilliance, physical fearlessness, the ability to inspire other fighters to exceed what they believed they were capable of. The black sword in his hand, which was Anglachel reforged by Nargothrond smiths and renamed Gurthang, Iron of Death, and which was, even then, more than a sword, which had a will in it, as the greatest blades of the First Age sometimes did, and whose will and its bearer's will were moving gradually into an alignment that the story would eventually make much of. He fell in love with Finduilas, the daughter of Orodreth, beautiful and gentle and possessed of a quality of clear-eyed perception that saw Túrin more accurately than most. She had loved Gwyndor before Túrin arrived with the specific, delicate love that had survived Gwyndor's years in Angband and his emergence from them diminished in body, if not in spirit. When Túrin came, something shifted in her. Not a choice, not a betrayal, but the specific, helpless quality of a heart that encounters something new and finds itself rearranging. She loved Túrin. Gwyndor saw it, and Gwyndor, with the bitter, exhausted clarity of someone who has survived too much to waste energy on convenient self-deception, told Túrin what he saw, told him also that the doom of Húrin's house was real, that the shadow was real, that Túrin should not bring it closer to people he cared about. Túrin did not listen. He very rarely listened. Not because he was unintelligent. He was, as we have established, exceptionally intelligent. But because listening, in the full sense of allowing another person's counsel to actually alter the course of action you have already committed to, required a kind of flexibility that Túrin's pride had never quite permitted. He heard Gwyndor. He processed what Gwyndor said, and then he continued doing what he had already decided to do, which was to be present in Nargothrond, to rise within it, to influence its policy in the direction his military instincts recommended. His influence bent Nargothrond toward openness, toward a more aggressive posture against Morgoth's forces, toward the building of a great bridge across the Narog that would allow swift deployment of armies, but that also inevitably made Nargothrond's hidden location considerably less hidden. Orodreth, who knew better, who felt the wrongness of this, allowed it. Because Túrin was persuasive, and because the military results were real, and because the specific gravity of Túrin's presence was, as it always was, very difficult to resist. Morgoth noticed. Of course, Morgoth noticed. Morgoth noticed everything that Túrin did, was watching for it, had been watching for years from the high seat where Húrin sat above him. And when Nargothrond began to extend its influence, when the black sword began to be spoken of in the whispers that run between armies, Morgoth recognized the hand behind it and began to prepare his answer. His answer was, as Morgoth's answers tended to be, in excess of what the question strictly required. He sent Glaurung, the father of dragons, the first and greatest of the fire drakes of the First Age, a creature of such power and such specific, deliberate malice that the other horrors Morgoth had created pale beside him. Not because Glaurung was the most physically destructive thing Morgoth had made, though he was destructive enough, but because Glaurung's particular gift, the thing that made him most useful to his master, was not fire. It was the power of his gaze, the ability to trap a mind within his eyes and show it things that were not there, or hide from it things that were, and to do this with such complete, masterful precision that the victim did not know it was happening, that they believed entirely and without reservation whatever Glaurung chose to make them believe. He came against Nargothrond, and Nargothrond fell. The great bridge that Túrin had built, against Orodreth's better judgment, against the whole careful tradition of Nargothrond's down existence, made the assault faster and more complete than it might otherwise have been. The city was taken. Its people were enslaved or killed. And Túrin, who had fought with everything he had, was captured by Glaurung. Held in place by the dragon's gaze, made to watch as the captives were led away, including Finduilas, who cried his name, who was taken north while he stood, frozen, unable to move, unable to act, unable to look away from the eyes that held him. Glaurung released him and told him, with the specific, layered cruelty of something that prefers its malice to have an intellectual dimension, told him that his mother and sister were living in misery in Dor Lomin and needed him, and that Finduilas was beyond saving. One of these things was a lie, the other was not. And Túrin, freed from the gaze but carrying everything the gaze had shown him, turned south toward Dor Lomin, away from Finduilas, away from the one chance he might have had in that direction of saving someone who needed saving. Rest now. Now Gothrond is behind us. The dragon has spoken, and Túrin is moving in the direction the curse always intended. Chapter 6, Dor Lomin and the Return. Breathe, dear one, all the way in. Let the breath fill you completely, all the way to the deepest part of the lungs, and then release it all at once. Good. You are here. You are held. The story is moving toward its center now, the place where the two great griefs of the final act are being set in motion simultaneously, each one unaware of the other, moving toward a meeting that neither of them could have prevented, even if they had known. Dor Lomin was Túrin's home, or had been, the home of his childhood, the land his father Húrin had ruled before the battle of unnumbered tears took Húrin away and left the land to the Easterlings, who had fought on Morgoth's side and been rewarded with the territory of those who had fought against him. The Easterlings had not been gentle with the people of Dor Lomin. They had not been gentle with Morwen, Túrin's mother, who had held on in the fierce, unbending way that was clearly where Túrin had gotten it from, with a pride so absolute that even the Easterlings who despised her could not quite bring themselves to fully break it. She was not there when Túrin arrived. She had left, had finally left years before to seek news of her son, to find the daughter she had borne after Túrin's departure, to do what she could in a world that had given her almost nothing to work with, and had watched her work with it anyway. The house was empty of her. The land he had run toward, had abandoned Finduilas for, had abandoned the captives of Nargothrond for, on the strength of Glaurung's lie, held none of what Glaurung had told him it held. His mother was gone. His sister was gone. The misery that had been described to him existed, but its subjects had moved beyond his reach. He dealt with the Easterlings in his home thoroughly, in the specific way that Túrin dealt with things that had harmed people he loved, with a completeness and a ferocity that left no doubt about the depth of the feeling behind it, and somewhat less room for nuance than the situation in its full complexity might strictly have warranted. He freed those who were enslaved. He did what he could. And then, because this was always what Túrin did when one door closed, he moved on, toward the next place, toward the next identity, toward the forest of Brethil, where he would find for a time something that looked like peace. Brethil was a forest, a real forest, not the corrupted shadow wood of Taur Nufuin, but an ordinary, living, ancient forest of the First Age, full of the ordinary life of trees and deer and small streams running over moss-covered stones. The men of Brethil lived in it, Haleth's folk, a proud and independent people with their own traditions and their own fierce attachment to their woodland home. They had been fighting a long, losing, grinding defensive action against Morgoth's encroachments, in the way of a people who know they are probably going to lose and have decided to make the losing cost as much as possible. He came to them in disguise. Another name, Turambar, he called himself. Master of Doom. Which is a name that requires a moment of attention, my dear ones, because it is either the bravest thing a man has ever named himself or the most desperately wishful, depending on which reading of it you bring. Master of Doom. The man who has decided that the doom which pursues him will be mastered, that he will face it and overcome it, that the pattern will break, that this time, in this forest, with these people, under this name, the shadow will not find him. He was useful to the men of Brethil immediately. Of course he was. Turin was always immediately useful, his gifts being the kind that are visible within minutes of his arrival in any difficult situation. He helped them fight. He helped them think about how to fight. He introduced tactics that their tradition had not developed, because their tradition had been shaped by generations of defensive thinking, and Turin's thinking was constitutionally, almost physically, incapable of being purely defensive. They grew to trust him. They grew to need him, in the way that communities that are losing tend to need the person who arrives and makes the losing stop for a while. He wanted to rest. I want to say this clearly and with the full weight it deserves, because it is one of the most human things about Turin in this chapter of his story. He wanted, genuinely and completely, to rest, to stop being the person the doom pursued, to set down the black sword and live in the forest among ordinary people and be, if not happy exactly, then at least not actively, catastrophically unhappy. He had been running, in one form or another, since he was 8 years old. He had constructed and abandoned more identities than most people ever develop in a lifetime. He was tired. The specific, bone-deep, soul-deep tiredness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and cannot put it down, but has found in Brethil a place where he can almost pretend to. And then there was the woman from the river. A woman found by the men of Brethil near the falls of Dimrost, unconscious, alone, with no memory of who she was or where she had come from. No name, no past, no history except the immediate physical fact of her presence in the forest, alive and beautiful, and entirely without the context that would have made the rest of the story impossible. They called her Nienor, which was the name of Turin's sister. He did not know this. He could not have known this. The woman did not know this. She did not know anything. That was the point. That was precisely, exactly, deliberately the point. Rest now. The forest is quiet. A woman has been found, and somewhere in the deep darkness of Angband, Glaurung is very still and very pleased. Chapter 7, Nienor. Shh. Be very still. Let your breathing be slow and complete, and entirely without effort. The way breathing is when the body has found its deepest ease. In and out. This chapter is the one the whole story has been building toward in its deepest structure. Not the dragon, not the sword. This. The two of them in the forest, not knowing. And the not knowing being the whole of the tragedy. Let me tell you about Nienor. The real Nienor. The one who existed before Glaurung took her memory, so that you understand what was lost when the loss happened. She was Turin's younger sister, born after he left Dorlomin, raised by Morwen in the shadow of Húrin's absence and the Easterling occupation, growing up in circumstances that would have broken someone less made of the particular, stubborn, bright, burning material of Húrin's bloodline. She was fierce. She was brave. She had the dark hair and the gray eyes that ran in the family like a signature, a physical reminder that these people were all made of the same extraordinary and doomed stuff. She had gone looking for Turin with Morwen, because that is what Húrin's women did when the world gave them the opportunity. They went looking for the things they loved, rather than sitting at home, waiting for the things they loved to come back to them. They had reached Nargothrond, or the ruin of it, and there Glaurung had found them, had found Nienor specifically, had looked at her with the specific intentionality of something that has been directed by its master toward a particular act of destruction, and has the intelligence to know exactly how to perform it. He took her memory, not in a dramatic, visible way, not with fire or with force, with his gaze. The same gaze that had frozen Turin before the gates of Nargothrond turned now toward a different purpose, not paralysis, but erasure. He stripped from her everything she knew, her name, her mother, her brother, her history, the whole accumulated context of a human life, the specific, irreplaceable network of relationship and memory and identity that makes a person themselves, rather than simply a body moving through the world. Gone. In the time it takes a dragon to hold a gaze and choose to look deeply. She fled then, into the forest, in terror, running from the great, terrible presence that had done this to her, running without knowing where she was running to, or what she was running from, or who she was. She ran until she fell. She was found by the men of Brethil near the falls of Dimrost, unconscious and alone, and entirely without herself. Turin found her, or was among those who found her. And this is where the story does something that requires us to sit very carefully with what we are witnessing. Because what happens next is not a failure of perception or a failure of love. It is the success of Glaurung's design. Turin did not recognize his sister because she did not look like his sister. He had been 8 years old when he left Dorlomin, had not seen her since, had no image of a grown Nienor to compare to the woman in the forest. She did not recognize him because she did not recognize anything. She had no self to recognize him with. He was kind to her. This is important. He was gentle, in the specific, careful way of a man who has seen too much suffering and who responds to someone else's suffering with the immediate, unguarded protectiveness that is one of his most genuine qualities. He helped her recover in the sense that recovery was possible, helped her learn to speak again, to move through the world, to build a new self from the materials that were available to a person with no past. And in that helping, something grew, slowly. In the way of things that grow in the forest, without announcement, without drama, with the quiet inevitability of life finding its way toward whatever light is available. He called her Ninil, Tear Maiden, for the tears she shed when she first came to herself in Brethil. The name is both tender and, in retrospect, precisely, horribly apt. He did not know he was naming her. He was simply giving a name to someone who had none, in the instinctive way of someone who understands that a person without a name is a person without full existence. He gave her a name. He gave her a home in Brethil. He gave her, in time, himself. They were married in the forest, in the way of the men of Brethil, under the trees that neither of them knew were witnessing something that should not have been permitted to happen. Were they happy? I have thought about this question, my dear ones, and I want to answer it honestly. Yes, I believe they were. In the forest of Brethil, in the time they had, before the dragon came, before the knowing, I believe Turin was as close to genuinely, simply happy as he had ever been. He had the forest and the community and the fighting that gave him purpose, and Ninil, who loved him with the open, unguarded love of someone who has no complicated history to bring to it because their history has been taken. And Turin, who had carried so much history for so long, found in her uncomplicated love something that felt very close to rest. She was with child. When the news of Glaurung's approach came, when the dragon's attention finally turned inevitably toward Brethil and toward the black sword whose bearer had escaped him before, Ninil was carrying Turin's child, and she was afraid. Not of the dragon specifically. She did not have the specific history with Glaurung that would have made her afraid of him in particular. She was afraid of losing what she had, of the specific physical fear of a woman who has found something worth having and can feel it being threatened. Turin went to face Glaurung. Because of course he did. Because this was Turin, the man who had never walked away from a fight he felt was his to fight, who had perhaps never in his adult life made the choice to simply not. He went with the specific, burning, sword-drawn purpose of someone who has decided that this time, the doom will be met and mastered. Rest now. The forest is still. The child is unborn. And the dragon is coming. Chapter 8. Glaurung at the Kabed en Aras. Breathe now, very slowly. All the way in. Hold it for just a moment, and then all the way out. Good. You are doing beautifully. We are nearly at the end of the story now, and the ending is close enough that I want you to be completely comfortable before we enter it. Completely rested. Completely held. Because what happens at the Kabed en Aras, the Deer's Leap, the deep gorge where the river Teiglin cuts through the rock, is the chapter that everything before it has been building toward. Glaurung came against Brethil as only a dragon comes, with the slow, absolute, entirely assured approach of something that does not hurry, because hurrying implies the possibility of not arriving in time. And Glaurung was not concerned about arriving in time. He came through the forest with the specific sound of something enormous, moving through trees that were not built to accommodate something that large. He came with fire, and with the weight of his body, and with, behind his eyes, the particular intelligence of a creature who enjoys what he is doing, and has been instructed to enjoy this specific thing very thoroughly. Turin went to meet him at the Kabed en Aras, a narrow gorge where the Teiglin ran far below, too steep for Glaurung to easily cross. A place where the terrain might give a single fighter with a black sword the kind of advantage that terrain sometimes gives to the smaller combatant against the larger one. He went alone, essentially, with companions who held back as he required, who watched from a distance as he descended into the gorge and approached the dragon on the far bank with the specific, controlled, magnificent fearlessness that was simultaneously his greatest gift and the most direct expression of everything that was going to kill him. He killed Glaurung. Let us be clear about this. Túrin Turambar killed the father of dragons, drove the black sword up into the dragon's belly as Glaurung stretched across the gorge, put all of his strength and all of his will and all of the years of everything he had carried into a single upward thrust, and the blade went in. Glaurung screamed, the scream of a very large and very ancient thing that has been mortally wounded. The sound of it rolling through the forest like a second catastrophe, waking everyone in Brethil who had been pretending to sleep, driving away every living thing small enough to flee. The effort of it left Túrin unconscious. He fell beside the dying dragon on the bank of the gorge, with Gurthang still in the wound and the great body of Glaurung collapsing slowly across the rock, and lay there. In the specific, complete unconsciousness of someone who has spent everything, every reserve, every trained capacity, every drop of the will that had sustained him through 30 years of doom, on a single act, and has nothing left for what comes after. Niniel came, despite being told not to, despite being pregnant, despite the fear and the companions who tried to keep her back. She came because she was Húrin's daughter, even if she did not know it. And Húrin's daughters do not stay back when someone they love is lying still on a rock in the dark. She came and found him breathing, alive, just unconscious. The wound from the sword thrust to the belly not life-threatening, the black sword still in the dragon. And then Glaurung opened his eyes. One last time. In the specific, terrible, deliberately chosen last act of a creature who has been given a purpose by his master and intends to complete it even in dying, because completing it in dying is, in a sense, more complete than completing it while alive. He looked at Niniel, and with the last of his power, with whatever Morgoth had given him that was draining away with his blood into the rocks of the gorge, he gave her back her memory. All of it. Everything. Her name, her mother, her brother, The whole accumulated context of who she was and where she had come from, and what the man lying unconscious on the rock beside her was to her. Not gradually, not with the mercy of slow realization, all at once, in the specific, total, annihilating way that Glaurung did everything, completely, without remainder. She understood. Instantly, completely, with the full force of a mind that had once been sharp and was now receiving information that it had no framework to absorb, because no framework exists for this. She understood who she was. She understood who Túrin was. She understood what they were to each other. She understood what had happened between them. She understood the child she was carrying. All of it, at once, beside the dying dragon, above the gorge. She cried out. Tolkien records the words, the full cry of recognition and horror, and the name she called him by. And then she ran. Not away from him, away from everything. To the edge of the gorge, to the Cabed en Arras, to the place where the river Teiglin ran far below, cold and fast and entirely indifferent to the woman standing above it with a memory she could not survive having received. She jumped, and the river took her. And the river, Tolkien tells us, was never afterward called by its old name, was called from that day the Cabed Neramarth, the leap of dreadful doom. And no living thing walked on its banks or drank from its waters willingly thereafter. Túrin woke. The companions told him. He heard. And the specific quality of that hearing, the hearing of the worst possible truth, delivered in the worst possible moment by people who cannot make it softer because there is no softer version of it, is something I will not attempt to describe directly. Some things are better witnessed in silence than narrated. He heard, and he understood, and he walked away from the gorge into the forest. Rest now. The dragon is dead. The river has taken her, and the black sword is still in the wound. Chapter 9, the last name. We are nearly at the end, my dear ones. Nearly at the place the story has been moving toward since the moment Morgoth placed his curse on Húrin's line in the darkness of Angband. Take a breath with me, slow and full, all the way in and out. Let yourself be completely rested and completely held for what remains. Túrin went to the Howden Eleth, the mound of the Elven Maid, the grave of Finduilas, who had been taken from Nargothrond and who had died on the road north crying Túrin's name as those who had survived told it. He had not been there for her death, had turned south toward Dorlomin on the strength of Glaurung's lie, had left her to the orcs and the road and the specific terrible end of someone calling a name that no one came to answer. He had known this for years, had carried it in the same place where he carried Beleg, in the interior archive of the things he had done, and the things that had happened, and the things he could not make different. He went there because he had nowhere else to go, because every other direction, north, south, east, the forest, the community of Brethil, The whole geography of his life up to this moment was now either closed or ruined, or carrying an association he could not stand to be near. He went to the mound of the Elven Maid, and he stood there, and he was in those moments the sum of everything the story had made of him. Not destroyed, not yet, but finished, in the specific sense of something that has been used up, that has given everything it had to give and received in return the full, unmodified weight of everything the curse intended. Now he took Gurthang, the black sword, Anglachel reforged, Beleg's sword renamed, the blade with a will in it that had moved through the whole of this story as a presence alongside its bearer. He spoke to it. This is one of the most extraordinary moments in all of Tolkien. A man speaking to his sword, asking it to do what he was asking it to do, asking it to be, one final time, the instrument of a will that had decided, with full consciousness and complete deliberation, that the story was over. And the sword answered. This is the thing that I find most devastating about this moment. Not the act itself, but the sword's answer. Tolkien records that Gurthang replied that the blade spoke in whatever language swords speak in the first age of the world when they have wills of their own, and said that it would serve him gladly, one last time, gladly. The sword was glad. The iron that had been Anglachel, that had been Beleg's, that had killed the dragon and been in the wound and had moved through the whole terrible arc of this story. The sword was glad to do this last thing. And so the doom was completed. On the mound of the Elven Maid in the forest with the black sword. Turin Turambar, who had been Túrin, son of Húrin, and Nathan the wronged, and Adanedel the elf-man, and Agarwain the blood-stained, and Mormegil the black sword, and Turambar the master of doom, came to his final name, or his first one, the one his mother had given him, the one under which the curse had always run. Let us stay with the question for a moment. The question that the whole story has been building toward, that I told you at the beginning we would not resolve because the story does not resolve it. Was this the curse? Or was this Túrin? Was it Morgoth's working, the great shadow laid on Húrin's line before the boy was born, shaping the world around him toward ruin with the patient malice of something very old and very committed? Or was it the man himself, the pride that would not bend, the stubbornness that would not be counseled, the inability to remain in any place long enough to let the people who loved him actually help him? And the answer, my answer offered with all appropriate humility, is that the question itself is the point. That the curse and the character are inseparable, as we said at the beginning. That Morgoth chose Túrin's line for a reason, chose the bloodline of the proudest man in Beleriand, because pride, when amplified by darkness, becomes the very mechanism of its own destruction. That the curse did not create Túrin's flaws, it used them. With the specific, cold expertise of a being who had spent the entire history of the world studying what living things are made of and how to turn them against themselves. And yet, And yet the courage was also real. The love was real. The grief was real. The friendship with Beleg was real. The happiness in the forest with Niniel in the time before the knowing was real. The dragon killing was real. All of it was real. The greatness and the catastrophe were made of exactly the same material, which is perhaps the most honest thing a story can say about what it means to be human. That your gifts and your destruction are not separate things. That what makes you extraordinary is the same thing that makes you dangerous to yourself and to everyone who loves you. There is a prophecy at the end of the Silmarillion's account, that at the end of all things, at the Dagor Dagorath, the last battle, when Morgoth himself returns from the void and the world is remade, Túrin will be there, will return, will be the one to drive the black sword through Morgoth's black heart, will be, at the very last, the instrument not of his own doom, but of Morgoth's. The master of doom becoming, in the final accounting of the universe, the doom of the one who made him. Whether you believe in this prophecy, whether you read it as genuine cosmological vision, or as the consolation that stories sometimes offer to the irreversible, is your own business, my dear ones. I offer it simply as what the record contains, as the last word Tolkien's legendarium has for Turin Turambar. Not only victim, not only tragedy, not only the man destroyed by the doom laid on his father's line, but also, eventually, finally, at the very end of all things, the one who answers it. Rest now. The story is almost complete. One chapter remains, the chapter that holds all of it together and asks what it means to carry a story like this into sleep. Chapter 10. What the Stars Remembered. Here we are then, the last chapter, the place the story has been moving toward, through the shadow of Morgoth, and the halls of Doriath, and the wild years, and the darkness of Taur Nufuin, and Nargothrond, and Brethil, and the gorge above the river, and the mound of the Elven Maid. We are here, and the last chapter is not tonight a chapter of events. It is a chapter of holding, of looking at the whole shape of what we have been given, and finding in that shape something to carry into sleep. Let your breathing go all the way slow now, all the way down into the deep, unhurried rhythm of genuine rest. In and out, a little more. Good. You are almost there, dear one. Let the whole evening's story settle into you, all of it. The curse and the friendship and the dragon and the forest and the river. Let it all settle like snow settling, slowly, completely, covering everything in the same quiet white. The stars of the first age of Middle-earth. I want you to imagine them for a moment. Not the stars as you know them, filtered through a sky that has been dimmed by centuries of civilization, but the stars of Beleriand before the sea swallowed it. The stars that elves navigated by that men made their first myths of, that burned in a sky so dark and so unpolluted by anything other than themselves that they must have seemed to the people looking up at them impossibly, almost aggressively present, as though the universe were leaning in, as though it wanted specifically to be seen. Those stars witnessed what we have told tonight. They were there above Húrin, hidden by the corrupted canopy, but there. They were there above Nargothrond when the dragon came. They were there above the Cabed en Arras, reflected briefly in the river before Nienor reached it. They were there above the mound of the elven maid when Túrin came to his ending. Stars are very good at witnessing. They do not intervene, they do not judge, they do not select which events are worth their light and which are not. They simply shine on everything with the same complete and indifferent and somehow deeply comforting light. What do we make of Túrin Turambar at the end of all of this? I have been sitting with the question, my dear ones, in the way I sit with questions, with a great deal of patience and a rather specific investment that I do not intend to fully disclose. And here is what I have arrived at. He was not a villain. This seems obvious, but is worth saying, because the accumulation of catastrophe in his story can, if you are not careful, produce a reading in which he is primarily responsible for everything that happened, and the curse is primarily an excuse. He was not a villain. He was a man of extraordinary gifts who lived inside a doom that knew exactly which of his qualities to lean on in order to make those gifts serve its purposes. And he was not simply a victim. This also seems obvious, but is also worth saying, because the other available reading, the one in which Morgoth's curse is total and Túrin is entirely without agency, entirely at the mercy of something he could not have resisted, does not do justice to the genuine, freely chosen quality of the choices he made. He chose to leave Doriath before the verdict. He chose the bridge at Nargothrond. He chose Turambar as his name. These choices were his, made under the shadow of the curse, yes, made in a world that the curse had tilted toward ruin, but his. And the story honors him enough to let them be his, even when they cost him everything. Beleg. Let me speak of Beleg one final time, because this is where I always want to return at the end of this story. Not to the dragon, not to the gorge, not to the black sword on the mound of the elven maid, but to the friend who came back, who tracked him across half of Beleriand, who held the knife in the dark with Túrin's name in his mouth. If there is a counterweight to the doom in this story, something that the curse could not account for, could not predict, could not use against him, it is Beleg. The love that followed him without condition, the loyalty that did not require him to be better than he was. Even the doom could not make Beleg stop coming back. It could only arrange the darkness, and the knife, and the moment, but not the love itself. The love was real, and the doom could not make it unreal. It could only use it. Which is perhaps the most devastating thing about the curse, not that it destroyed, what was good in Túrin's life, but that it used the good things, used Beleg's loyalty, used Finduilas's love, used Niniel's uncomplicated, unhistoried heart, used every bright thing as the instrument of a darker outcome. And yet the bright things were still bright. This is what I want you to carry into sleep tonight, my dear ones. Not the doom, not the darkness, not the dragon or the gorge or the sword. The bright things. Beleg in the forest, tracking his friend with the specific, unwavering love of someone who has decided that this person is worth finding. Turin in the early years of Brethil, sitting in the forest among ordinary people and being, for a little while, almost rested. Niniel, before the memory returned, loved and loving in a forest that was genuinely, simply beautiful. These things were real. The doom did not make them unreal. It only made them finite. Everything is finite, my dear ones. This is the thing that the first age of Middle-earth understood in a way that later ages sometimes forgot. The thing that gives the stories of that age their specific, irreducible quality of aching beauty. That the trees of Beleriand are more beautiful because the sea is coming for them. That the elves of Doriath are more themselves because the world is changing around them. That the friendship of Turin and Beleg is more complete, not less. More, because of what it cost. Finitude is not the enemy of beauty. It is sometimes the condition that makes beauty possible. The stars of the first age still burn. Not above Beleriand. Beleriand is under the sea now, has been for ages. The whole landscape of this story, lying somewhere beneath the Atlantic if you want to locate it in the world as it currently exists. But the stars themselves, the same stars that were there above Taur Nufuin and the Cabed en Arras and the mound of the Elven Maid, are still there, still burning, still witnessing, still shining on everything with the same complete and indifferent and somehow comforting light. They remember, in the way that stars remember, silently, continuously, without being asked. Sleep now, my dear ones. Let the story settle around you, like the forest of Brethil settles around its sleeping people, ancient and breathing and full of the specific, irreplaceable life of a place that has been here longer than the people in it, and will be here after them. Let the doom be far away. Let the darkness be soft. Let what you carry from this story be not the weight of the tragedy, but the specific, stubborn, entirely real brightness of the things that the tragedy could not make unreal. Beleg came back. That is true. The forest was beautiful. That is true. The stars are still burning. That is true. And the black sword at the last battle will be raised one more time. That too, Tolkien promises us, true. Sleep now. Sleep. The story is complete. The stars are holding everything. And you, my dear one, are held entirely, completely held. Good night. Good night.